Okay, Assalamualaikum. Hello. Uh, we have actually gone through much of the guidelines tomorrow. That is the diagnostic part mostly. Is my voice audible and is the screen visible to all of you? So I think we'll just I'll just go through a brief recap of what we had been through tomorrow, because we're building up on that in this session. So regarding autoimmune hemolytic anemia, we first they need to have a sort of a background knowledge about it, that that is basically since it's autoimmune, it's actually a host immune system acting against its own red cell antigens, and this causes hemolysis. Now it's actually the decompensated form of hemolysis which becomes manifest in the form of clinical features, and also in the form of those lab range lab values. The clinical features would be mostly in the form of signs of anemia and hemolysis, where there be jaundice in dark urine, and also there could be signs of an underlying disease. Since most of the causes that we'll come across of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, they are mostly um, uh, they're mostly like they may be cold, warm, or mixed type, and they both have primary and secondary causes. As is also as this can be seen from this chart as well, which shows the warm type of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. That is the primary and secondary causes, and the secondary causes are mostly infections and neoplasms and immune dysregulations. And immune dysregulations can include common variable immune deficiency syndromes and also post-transplantation also. And even with the autoimmune disorders like SLE, sarcoidosis, scleroderma, Sjogren's, and even with the infections like hepatitis C, HIV, CMV. So all of these can also cause sort of a warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And neoplasias like CLL and lymphomas. In the cold also we have in the cold we have two main categories: the cold hemagglutinin disease and the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. When we work up for cold autoimmune hemolytic anemias, then we need to actually look up most of these things about they had stated earlier that about 65% of the cases are warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and of the rest, most of 5% will be mixed type. So the rest 30% of the 30%, 29% of them are cold hemagglutinin disease, and only 1% is paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. So we'll also go across an algorithm in which we'll first be actually try to rule out the cold hemagglutinin disease, and when this has been excluded, then we will take the features of paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria into account, because this is relatively rarer than the cold hemagglutinin disease, which is more common. So in the cold hemagglutinin disease, this also has primary and secondary causes. PCH also has primary and secondary causes. Now for cold hemagglutinin disease, secondary causes, since it is mostly IgM associated, so then the causes, all the M's, malignancy, the mycoplasma, infectious mononucleosis, and also Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia, in which along with CLL, NHL is also Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia. And then also post-allogenic hematopoietic stem cell transplant in autoimmune diseases. Paroxysmal cold hemoglobinurias are, and in the cold hemagglutinin disease, these are usually in the primary form. They are usually in elderly, and they can present with the clinical features of cold-induced acrocyanosis and Raynaud's phenomena. And the secondary causes, they since there will be an underlying disorder in this case. So the underlying disorder is mostly these infections and autoimmune disease or the post-transplant setting. So in these circumstances, in the case of cold agglutinin disease, it can also occur basically in children, since infections are more common in children. So and most of the forms, like those which are associated with infections, they are also self-limiting. So based on this, also we can differentiate between cold and cold. This is basically the historical findings that we look for when we want to differentiate the primary cold hemagglutinin disease from the secondary cold hemagglutinin disease, which is also known as the cold agglutinin syndrome. So this is also known as cold agglutinin syndrome. And in case of so this would be primary is like the classical CHAD, and the secondary is the cold agglutinin syndrome. And in this syndrome then includes all these various manifest findings, and most of the causes are due to secondary to infection. And then if we go into the causes of primary of paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, this is of course paroxysmal, so it is mostly will be transient. And hemoglobinuria, and this occurs and this is cold since it's precipitated by cold. And hemoglobinuria, it is due to presence of hemoglobin, not RBCs. It's not frank blood microscopy would be negative for red blood cells. It's hemoglobinuria which would be present. And this can occur. This is occur in children, and mostly it occurs secondary to upper respiratory tract infections like the influenza, adenovirus, and infectious mononucleosis, and even in mumps and measles. So most of the infections of the upper respiratory tract or of also abdominal infections can also be there, and in some adults it is also due to syphilis. So these infections usually they trigger this. They can present 1 to 2 weeks after these infections with these symptoms of fever and abdominal pain and leg pain and hemoglobinuria. And hemolysis can be severe because in this case it will be intravascular even, but it usually settles after several weeks. Then regarding the other forms of if we go into the this is basically all about autoimmune hemolysis, how we classify autoimmune hemolysis. So whenever we're going to go into this will be actually the historical background that we need to know when we want to take history of these cases. Then the diagnostic approach would basically be that we first have to document hemolysis, and then we would need to go into the findings of whether the hemolysis is immune or not by a DAT. And then we will go on to find if the DAT is positive and it is immune mediated, then we will need to confirm the autoimmune nature. Now, since hemolysis, they have already given these causes of hemolysis, that it can not only be not only is it hereditary, but where there can be membranopathies, enzymopathies, and hemoglobinopathies. It can also be acquired, in which cases there can be immune and non-immune causes. Most of the immune causes are autoimmune. This is what this is the part which we are going to be discussing. And the alloimmune and drug-induced causes, they need to be ruled out in history when we should take history of transfusion and transplant, and of any ABO mismatch as in HDN and HDFN. So, drug-induced, we need to take a history of any drugs that they have been taking. Then non-immune causes would include all the mechanical and the chemical causes, and the physical causes even of thrombotic sort of the thrombosis in the blood vessels, which can, and extracorporeal circuits, which can cause the obstruction in the flow of blood and therefore lead to hemolysis of the blood within the capillaries. So, but they will be classified as non-immune because they do not have any immune antibodies attached with the RBCs. It's just it's just basically toxins or infectious agents or mechanical obstructions that are causing the intravascular hemolysis in the patient. Then so this is all that we need to look into when we're considering whether it's hemolysis or not. Now these findings they have actually mentioned that these are typical. There'll be an increased bilirubin, and the retics count is increased, and LDH is increased, and hemoglobin is reduced, and the blood film will show spherocytes, agglutination, and polychromasia. And then this is all regarding the blood examination. And then the urine examination, urine will be negative for blood cells, but it will be positive, but it will show hemoglobinuria. And hemosiderin can also be detected 1 week, even 1 week after onset of intravascular hemolysis. Now, this is the typical findings, but there will be some atypical. We need to take the whole picture into account, because sometimes the unconjugated especially this reticulocyte count. This reticulocyte count is supposed to be increased when there's hemolysis, But there can be reticulocytopenia also as they have mentioned in the guidelines, that there can be reticulocytopenia, especially in conditions with the parvovirus infection. And also if it is very early in the, if it is a very acute intravascular hemolysis and the reticulocyte count has not been able to increase so much to um, uh, to compensate for the hemolysis. And also there can be other causes where there can be aplasia of the bone marrow and malignancies. So in all those cases also the reticulocyte count, and even in cases of severe infection where there can be hemophagocytosis. So there are like exceptions to the rule. So the reticulocytopenia can also occur, especially with the infections. And then also with the parvovirus infection and parvovirus, and especially the parvovirus infection, and even severe infections like malaria, they may cause phagocytosis. So, and there can be different mechanisms involved, and also with the hematinic deficiency. So, whenever there is stress on the marrow due to frequently, and the retic count, it may show reticulocytopenia due to underlying hematinic deficiencies of B12 and folate. So, and then also these findings of an LDH being elevated and heptoglobin being reduced, they can also present in other liver diseases also. So basically, this is the typical finding, but there will be atypical findings that we need to take into account, and there will be confounding factors. So these parameters, especially with mild compensated hemolysis, so most of the findings will be not be typically met. And then to document the immune nature of the hemolysis, we need to do the DAT, and the DAT, the direct antiglobulin test, would then detect the this would is basically a screening test, and this would because as you have mentioned, there will be a lot of false positive DATs and a lot of false negative DATs also. So the false positive DATs would be that it is not specific for hemolysis, since it can also occur. It can also be positive in a lot of diseases that we went across. That is the liver disease, the renal disease, then in chronic infections and malignant and inflammatory disorders or autoimmune disorders like SLE, and then even in intravenous drugs like intravenous immunoglobulin and anti-thymocyte globulin. So all these can also lead to a positive DAT, and a negative DAT can also be there. It can be also autoimmune hemolytic anemia due to a negative DAT, with and especially in this case the DAT may be negative due to a low affinity hemoglobin antibody or a low levels of antibody bound antigens. So in this case, there may be a problem with the reagent. That is, the reagent is not strong enough to detect the antibody that is bound to the red blood cells, or the antibody may be have a low affinity, and so it may not be properly bound. It may not be bound in large enough quantity to be detected by the DAT. Since that would actually require that a certain amount of antibody, certain molecules of antibody to be attached to the surface of the red cell. So for a positive DAT, and, they've given certain values also in Denise also, that DAT can be detected almost about 100 to 500 IgG molecules per RBCs, and 400 to 1100 C3D molecules per RBCs. So these are like some of the limitations that if it is very low titer of these antibodies, then they may not be detected by that. So and even a low affinity and low levels of these antibodies, they may not be detected. And also the technique that is used, for example, tube testing may often miss a lot of antibodies, and so we need to proceed with the gel column agglutination. Then also the fact that most of the DATs that we have, the polyclonal DAT, they are IgG and C3D specific. So mostly in those cases that have atypical immunoglobulins like the IgA or IgM type, they may be missed. So we need to use monoclonal antibodies also. So they have stressed here also that for these cases, we need to have monoclonal IgG and IgA, IgA, and anti-CD3 monospecific antigens. And also we, before stating that it's a negative DAT, we may need to do column agglutination test, proceed from test tube to gel testing or solid phase testing, and even we may have to consider preparing red cell eluate testing. So if after all these measures, even if still then the DAT is negative, then it will be, we would still label it as DAT negative autoimmune hemolytic anemia and give a trial of steroids also. So if all other causes have been ruled out. So this is all about the data and its relevance, that first we need to confirm that there is no local sort of it's an autoimmune nature of hemolysis, that is there is no history of blood transfusion in the last 3 months, and also no transfusion, transplant, and no case of any ABO mismatch with the hemolytic disease of newborn. And then we can proceed with the investigations. So regarding the investigations, just very briefly, we'll go into the sort of these are basically a gist of the investigations. There is a primary evaluation for the hemolytic screen, and then we have the then we have all the hemolytic screen with the blood and the urine investigations. Then the immunoglobulin screen with the serum immunoglobulin electrophoresis and immunofixation, and the infectious screen, and also the autoimmune profile. So, and also the radiological test with CT abdomen and pelvis to rule out any malignancies. Now, these are baseline investigations that we'll be doing, and in this case, they mentioned that for the serum immunoglobulins, the sample needs to be taken at about room temperature. It is because, and then this the serum should be separated for the calculation of serum paraproteins. Since these paraproteins may also may also interfere with the DAT positivity, so we need to so before confirming that any such a case of positive DAT is due to these antibodies attached, we need to have this the immunofixation done, and serum electrophoresis for in cases of paraproteinemias. So mostly in case of cold agglutinin disease, this would be we need to rule this out in cases of when there is marked cell agglutination. So in those cases, or we need not only have to there could be like some circulating IgM monoclonal paraproteins, and these paraproteins can be detected by the serum electrophoresis. So most of the cases of CHAD, when the paraproteins are done, about 90% of cases come out to be come out to have an underlying etiology of lymphoproliferative disorder, and mostly the paraproteinemias. And in this case, care has to be taken that the sample must be kept at 37 degrees centigrade until the serum has been separated. So for the serum electrophoresis, this IgGs and immunofixation, the sample must be kept at 37 degrees centigrade. That is for the cold and antibodies to be detected, to be for the cold hemagglutinin disease to be the clinically significant antibodies to be detected, when a sample must be kept at 37 degrees centigrade until the serum has been separated, or else the antibodies will remain bound to the RBCs. So we have to keep it at room temperature so that the antibodies do not remain bound to the RBCs, and only the paraproteins are then detected by the serum protein electrophoresis. So the serum is separated at 37 degrees centigrade in these cases. And then for the paroxysmal cold hemoglobin also, there is some reference to this direct agglutination test that needs to be done. And in this direct agglutination test, the sample is basically we have the patient's plasma, and the patient's serum is incubated. Here, the patient's serum is incubated with the normal RBCs. So, and these are kept at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes. So, we have the patient's serum and normal RBCs that are incubated and kept for about 30 to 60 minutes at room temperature. And then we check for agglutination. So, if the agglutination is not present, then this clinically significant cold agglutinins can be then ruled out. Then we can rule out that there is no significant cold agglutinin disease. So this 37, so this testing at 37 degrees centigrade is prior testing at 37 degrees centigrade for these paraproteins also, that they should be tested. The serum should be kept at 37 before the sample should be kept at 37 before the serum is separated. And is there another pre-analytical sort of a measure that needs to be taken into in case of a direct agglutination test, that the patient's serum, and after it is incubated, patient serum and the normal RBCs, they are incubated at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes. And if no agglutination occurs, then the clinically significant cold hemogglutinins can be then ruled out, it can be excluded. And after that, to differentiate between the then we can also, for the DAT negative, we may have to go into red cell elevate and monospecific DATs with IgM, IgGA, and C3. And Donner Landsteiner would then be specific for the cases of paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. In these cases also, the age less than 18 years and hemoglobinuria and cold associated symptoms and atypical serology, these are suggestive of paroxysmal cold hemagglutinin disease. And also regarding other investigations in selected patients, we may have to go for a bone marrow biopsy, especially if the patient is elderly and there are features in history that suggest some sort of a marrow infiltration. So any sort of a lymphoma and malignancy and these primary cases of autoimmune disease presenting in elderly patients need to be ruled out. Then we also need to have a urine profile for urine electrolytes and LFTs, clotting, and urine dipstick measurement also needs to be done. I think some participant actually has mics turned off. I would, if there's anything that you need to ask, then you can turn on your mic. Otherwise, there will be some noise in between also. So I think now back to this, regarding this. So this was also another table that was important regarding the serological features of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. That is, they had mentioned in the guidelines that basically the warm type is of course mostly IgG, but it can also be IgG and C3, and very rare cases of C3 alone are present. So there was a very detailed guidelines which mentioned that only about 35% are IgG alone, whereas 56% will have both IgG and C3, and only 9% have C3 alone. So, and in these cases, usually they are against high incidence antigens, usually the Rh antigen and those surface antibody, the glycophorin proteins on the surface of antibodies. So those high incidence antigens, they are the usual target. And the specificity is mostly against the RHD, or it can be against E and small e and big E, and even small c and big C. And so it's mostly the RH specificity that is present in most of the cases. They have mentioned that 3% have the specificity. And the antibody titer at 4 degrees centigrade is not applicable, whereas the thermal amplitude is that they will bind optimally at 37 degrees centigrade. And then regarding the cold antibodies, if we go into the cold antibodies, then this is the primary cold. These are the primary cold hemagglutinin disease, and this needs to be this has the C3 complement, but this is not specific for the cold agglutinin disease, because this is also present. The DAT is positive in PCH also for C3, and also in mixed also, and also since it may be there 9% with the autoimmune hemolytic anemias, also C3 alone may be present. So in case of CHAD, there is no typical there's no typical feature that will detect that will point towards it, except that there would be a clinical history of the cold intolerance and all the causes of and then the DAT is shows this C3 positivity, and the antibody specificity is also usually anti-I, big I and small I, and rarely anti-PR also. And here mostly then the titers and the thermal amplitude will differentiate it from uh, the secondary form of cold hemagglutinin disease, that is the cold uh, agglutinin syndrome. So in this case, the titer is mostly raised. This will be less than 1:64, and in the case of cold hemagglutinin disease, it's more than 1:500. And usually the thermal amplitude, they have also mentioned that it is here it is less than 25, and here it will be more than or equal to 30 degrees centigrade when the when the cells are suspended in 30% bovine albumin. If they are suspended in saline, then the thermal amplitude can be as low as 25 even. So the temperature, the thermal amplitude is not so well defined, but this antibody titer is this is usually high in case of cold hemagglutinin disease. And, and then differentiating it from PCH, there's usually this anti-P specificity, and since PCH will need an exclusion of CHAD before we go into PCH, because since it is very rare, then there will be a history of children with respiratory tract infections that 1 to 2 weeks later develop the symptoms of hemoglobinuria, and they would be in this anti-P specificity. And usually the titer is also again less than 1:2. They're not very high titer, and their thermal amplitude is also a bit low. Then the classical CHAD, which has the high titer and the higher thermal amplitude. So then there was also this diagnostic pathway that was important, and I think here they've also mentioned that they mentioned the same things about the direct agglutination test and the EDTA sample that needs to be kept at 37 in a water bath 1 hour prior to removal of plasma for testing in cases of the cold autoantibody screen. And then in a patient with suspected CHAD, the clotted sample for protein electrophoresis also needs to be kept at 37. So these two temperatures, they are mentioned again also, that in direct agglutination test, the sample needs to be kept at 37, should be warmed to 37 degrees centigrade in a water bath 1 hour prior to removal of plasma for testing of the direct agglutinin disease. And then for immunofixation also, it needs to be kept at 37 degrees centigrade. It should ideally be transported at room temperature also, or otherwise it should be pre-warmed to 37 degrees centigrade. Actually, there is some question also that why it needs to be kept. I think we're going through this yesterday as well, that the to rule out, because basically we are ruling out other causes that may be present. The cold agglutinin disease would be there would be since we are doing up since there will be a positive cold antibody screen, then we need to further investigate it for other antibodies that are present. So then we will raise the temperature so that the cold antibodies they sort of are removed from the surface of the RBCs, and then we can test them for other proteins that may be present, for other clinically significant. And in this case, in the direct agglutination test, to bring it up to room temperature is important, because we need to here we need to test for clinically significant cold antibodies. Those cold antibodies that are active only at 4 degrees centigrade are not clinically significant at room temperature, that is in the vivo in the patient. So for these cases, I think that is why the temperature needs to be raised to about room temperature, so that the clinically significant antibodies are then be detected, and that we only go into the workup for clinically significant antibodies. And also for these paraproteins, when the antibodies have been removed from the surface of the RBC by raising the temperature to 37, then only we can detect, go on to for the classical detection of these paraproteinemias, which mostly they have mentioned 90% of cases with CHAD would have an underlying paraproteinemia. And this is in the algorithm that is basically important for the testing of hemolytic anemias. That is when first we need to document hemolysis, then a direct antiglobulin test. If those conditions where it is negative, we need to consider alternative causes, and then do the column agglutination method when monospecific reagent If still the DAT is, then also Donat-Landsteiner antibodies in children with hemoglobinuria. Donat-Landsteiner antibodies can be present in DAT negative. They can be DAT negative because they are basically IgG. They are bispecific, that they are IgG component with the they are that are reactive at that bind at cold temperatures, and then they activate the complement at room temperature. So these Donat-Landsteiner antibodies, then these are found in patients with these can be present in DAT negative individuals also, and also in cases where DAT is positive. Also, we need to rule out these Donat-Landsteiner antibodies, since some component of these patients, they may also show DAT positivity also. So then they're done here also. The Donat-Landsteiner antibodies will also be included if we are considering cold antibodies where the cold agglutinin screen is where if the cold agglutinin, if the direct agglutination test at room temperature is positive, then we are looking mostly for cold antibodies here. But if there are atypical features, that is these features of age less than 18 years and hemoglobinuria and cold associated hemolysis and atypical serological features, so then we need to rule out the Donat-Landsteiner. So in all atypical cases of cold agglutinin also, we need to first rule out the Donat-Landsteiner antibodies. And this is one test that if positive, it would rule in the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. However, if it is negative, then we can consider those antibodies to be warm autoantibodies, autoimmune hemolytic anemia causing bodies. Then just a reminder here that we'll be probably taking a short, it will actually be a short break in here because of the time limit for the duration of this these sessions are there 40 minutes. So we will rejoin again after about 2 minutes. If this session somehow abruptly ends, then please do rejoin, and we'll continue from here, because I think this was we had just gone up till the emergency management and last time, and this chart is something that we had done, and I just wanted to elaborate that they can be causes of negative negatives. We need to rule out false negative before by doing the column agglutination test, the monospecific reagents, and the column agglutination, the monospecific reagents, Donat-Landsteiner test, and then the red cell eluate. If these are negative and the red cell eluate is then positive, then these are DAT negative autoimmune hemolytic anemias. In case of DAT positive, also we need to rule out false positives by the transfusion history and the history of transplants and drugs, and also in case of fetuses, the ABO mismatch there also. So all these other causes of alternative causes of hemolysis and with the positive DAT need to be ruled out before we can consider them as being autoimmune hemolytic anemia. If IgG alone is present, then they are warm. If C3 and IgG are present, then we need to work up with a direct agglutination test for clinically significant antibodies. And here the titer would be then important, because if the titer is less, then we will be considering that they're insignificant cold agglutinins unless we have these atypical features. And if the titer is more than 64, then we just proceed on with the further investigations for whether they are classically C3 positive, or they have a component of mixed C3 and IgG, where they may be mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So I think we'll just rejoin again after a short interval, and then continue with this rescue treatment, or this emergency management. We had gone into the emergency management, but we'll just recap again the emergency management for both warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia and this primary cold hemagglutinin disease. So then what remains are these non-emergency managements, which we'll go into detail and probably just go through them word by word. So this is another follow chart, this algorithm therapeutic pathway for the primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia that we'll be going in detail. Okay, so I think I'll just take a short break, and then we'll rejoin so that we have the next 40 minutes or so with us for the remaining session.